Mark woke up to the sound of his alarm clock buzzing at 6:30 a.m. It was a Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, just another workday in New York City. He stretched, yawned, and rolled out of bed, already thinking about his morning routine. The sun shone brightly through his apartment window. The sky was a perfect blue, without a single cloud. It was the kind of day that made him appreciate living in the city. Mark lived alone in a small apartment in Brooklyn, and every morning he followed the same routine. After a quick shower, he dressed in his usual business casual attire, a light blue shirt and gray slacks. He grabbed his briefcase, double-checked that he had his wallet and keys, and stepped outside. The streets were already alive with people heading to work, coffee cups in hand, taxis honking as they rushed through intersections. Mark stopped at his favorite coffee shop on the corner. "Good morning, Mark," said the barista with a smile. "Morning, Lisa." "The usual, please," he replied. She handed him a steaming cup of black coffee. "Busy day ahead?" "Yeah, meetings all morning," he said, taking a sip. He walked to the subway station, blending into the morning crowd. The train arrived on time, packed as always. Mark found a spot near the door and pulled out his newspaper. People around him were engaged in small talk, flipping through their phones, or simply staring out the windows. As the train neared downtown Manhattan, Mark felt the usual excitement of being in the heart of the city. His office was in a building close to the World Trade Center. Another normal day at work was about to begin, or so he thought. Mark stepped off the subway at Cortlandt Street Station, joining the steady flow of workers making their way to the towering skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan. The streets were filled with the usual morning energy. Business people walking briskly, street vendors setting up their carts, and tourists gazing up at the skyline. As he approached his office building, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center, Mark checked his watch. 8:35 a.m. Right on time, he entered the lobby, greeted the security guard with a nod, and took the elevator up to the 23rd floor. "Morning, Mark," a familiar voice called out as the elevator doors opened. It was Sarah, his colleague and friend. "Morning, Sarah. Ready for another busy day?" he asked, walking to his desk. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Barely. I need coffee before I can function." Mark chuckled as he placed his briefcase on his desk and powered on his computer. The open-plan office was already bustling with life. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and the sound of colleagues chatting. At 8:45 a.m., Mark was reviewing a report when his phone rang. It was James, his manager. "Mark, can you come to the conference room? We need to go over the client presentation for tomorrow." "On my way," Mark replied, grabbing his notepad. As he walked toward the conference room, he glanced out the large office windows. The view of the city was breathtaking, with the World Trade Center standing tall against the clear blue sky. Just as he reached the door, a loud boom shook the building. The floor trembled, and the windows rattled violently. People froze. A few gasps filled the air. Then, chaos erupted. "What was that?" Sarah's voice was filled with fear. Mark's heart pounded as he rushed to the window. A huge cloud of smoke and debris was billowing from the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Flames licked the sky. People on the streets below were staring, some running in different directions. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Mark, what's happening?" Mark's mind raced. This wasn't normal. This wasn't an accident. And it wasn't over. The office was no longer a place of routine. It was filled with chaos. People stood frozen, their eyes wide with shock as they stared out the windows at the burning North Tower. Others fumbled for their phones, calling loved ones, their hands trembling. Mark felt his stomach tighten. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. "That's the World Trade Center," he muttered, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Sarah clutched his arm. "Was it a bomb?" Her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know." His throat was dry. The fire was spreading fast, black smoke pouring into the sky. James, their manager, rushed into the office. "Everyone away from the windows. We don't know what's happening." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his fear. A voice from the other side of the room cried out, "The news says a plane hit the tower." Murmurs spread through the office. "A plane? How is that possible? Was it an accident?" Mark's pulse quickened. He had flown many times for work. A plane crashing into a skyscraper in the middle of Manhattan? It didn't make sense. Then the sound came. A deep, low roar that grew louder, shaking the very foundation of the building. People turned toward the windows just in time to see another airplane, this time heading straight for the South Tower. In the span of seconds, it slammed into the skyscraper. A fireball erupted, sending glass and steel flying. The impact was deafening. Screams filled the office. Sarah covered her mouth, her body shaking. Mark felt his knees weaken. "Oh my God!" someone gasped. James took charge. "We need to leave. Now!" The entire floor came alive with movement. Chairs scraped against the ground. Papers fluttered to the floor. People grabbed their bags, some stumbling in panic. Mark turned to Sarah, who was still staring at the burning tower. "Sarah, come on." He took her hand, pulling her toward the exit. The hallways were filled with employees from other offices, all moving toward the stairwell. The elevator was out of the question. No one wanted to be trapped inside. As they reached the stairwell, the flow of people slowed. Hundreds of feet stomped down the stairs, voices overlapping in panic. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He squeezed Sarah's hand. "We're going to be okay. Just keep moving." But in the back of his mind, a terrifying thought lingered. Was this just the beginning? The stairwell was packed. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of hurried breaths, nervous murmurs, and the distant wail of sirens from below. The walls vibrated as more explosions echoed in the distance. Mark gripped Sarah's hand tightly as they descended, step by step, in an unsteady rhythm dictated by the slow-moving crowd. People from other floors had joined them, making the staircase a tight, suffocating space. A woman behind them was crying softly. "My husband works in the North Tower. I can't reach him." Mark wanted to comfort her, but he had no words. How do you reassure someone when you don't even know if you'll make it out? Suddenly, the movement stopped. A man further down the stairs yelled, "Why aren't we moving?" "We don't know," another voice responded. The line of people became restless. The panic, which had been bubbling beneath the surface, erupted. "We need to move. We can't stay here." Sarah squeezed Mark's hand. What if something collapsed? Mark tried to remain calm. "We have to stay focused. There's no way out but down." Then the unthinkable happened. The building shook. A deep, terrifying rumble rolled through the walls, and the stairwell seemed to tremble. The impact knocked several people off balance. A few fell against the railing, catching themselves just in time. A woman screamed. Someone above yelled, "Is the building falling?" Mark felt his stomach drop. James, their manager, pushed forward. "Keep moving. Go." The crowd responded instantly. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a desperate rush downward. Mark and Sarah moved as fast as they could, gripping the railing to keep from falling. Sweat dripped down Mark's forehead. The air was hot, stale, filled with the metallic scent of panic. The lower they got, the thicker the smoke became. Sarah coughed, covering her mouth with her sleeve. "I can't breathe." Mark pulled off his tie, handing it to her. "Cover your face. It'll help." The stairwell door on the 10th floor suddenly burst open, and a firefighter stepped in, his face covered in soot. "This way. Move quickly, but stay calm," he ordered, guiding them toward the final exit. Mark and Sarah rushed forward, the cool air of the lobby hitting them like a shock. But as they stepped outside, their relief turned to horror. The streets were chaos. People running, crying, covered in ash. Sirens blared from every direction. And when Mark turned, he saw the North Tower burning, flames swallowing the upper floors. A terrifying thought hit him. Would the towers stand, or would they fall? Mark and Sarah barely had time to process the chaos around them. Sirens wailed, people screamed, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. The street was filled with thousands of people, some running, others frozen in shock, staring at the burning towers. Mark turned to Sarah. "We need to get as far away as possible." Sarah, coughing into the fabric of his tie, nodded weakly. They pushed forward, weaving through the terrified crowd. Every few seconds, another explosion-like sound echoed from above, sending waves of panic through the streets. Then, an ominous rumbling filled the air. Mark froze. The sound was deep, thunderous, like a massive structure groaning under its own weight. A voice in the crowd screamed, "It's falling! Run!" Mark grabbed Sarah's hand and sprinted. Behind them, the South Tower collapsed. The world turned into a roaring nightmare. The ground shook violently as if an earthquake had struck the city. A monstrous cloud of dust and debris erupted into the streets, swallowing everything in its path. Sarah tripped. Mark pulled her up, his lungs burning as they ran. The dust storm overtook them in seconds. The world went dark. Mark's eyes stung. He couldn't see more than a foot in front of him. The air was thick, suffocating. Every breath was a struggle. "Sarah," he choked, squeezing her hand tighter. "I'm here," she coughed. I can't breathe." Mark looked around desperately. They needed to get out of the cloud. Through the haze, he saw a convenience store with its doors still open. He pulled Sarah toward it. They stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor. A few others had also sought shelter. A man in a suit, his face covered in ash, was crying. A woman clutched her cell phone, redialing a number over and over, whispering, "Please pick up, please." Sarah was gasping for air. Mark ripped a sleeve from his shirt, poured water from a bottle he found, and handed it to her. "Breathe through this." She pressed the damp fabric to her face, taking slow, shaky breaths. Minutes passed. The world outside remained silent except for the distant sound of sirens. Then another deep rumble. Everyone in the store looked at each other, eyes wide with horror. Mark didn't even need to look. The North Tower was coming down. The ground trembled again. Another shockwave of dust roared through the streets, engulfing everything once more. When the sound finally faded, an eerie silence settled over the city. No one spoke. No one moved. The towers were gone. Mark and Sarah eventually stepped outside. The sky was gray, filled with ash and smoke. The once busy streets of New York were now unrecognizable, covered in debris, abandoned cars, and layers of dust. People walked in a daze, some crying, some holding on to strangers for support. Mark took Sarah's hand. "We're alive." She nodded, wiping soot from her face. But so many aren't. They looked at the skyline where two giants once stood. Nothing remained but emptiness. Mark swallowed hard. The world changed today. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Yes, but we're still here, and we keep going." And with that, they took their first steps toward an uncertain future. The city had fallen, but its people would rise again. The next morning, the city felt different. The once bustling streets of New York were now quiet, filled with dust and sorrow. People moved slowly, as if still trying to understand the unthinkable. Mark sat on the steps of his apartment, staring at the skyline. The towers were gone. It still didn't feel real. Sarah sat beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "It's hard to believe," she whispered. Mark nodded. Yesterday, everything felt normal. And now his voice trailed off. A group of volunteers passed by, handing out water and masks. Firefighters, exhausted but determined, continued their search through the rubble. Strangers hugged each other, offering comfort without words. Despite the tragedy, something incredible was happening. People were coming together. Mark exhaled slowly. "New York isn't just buildings," he said. "It's the people. And we're still here." Sarah gave a small smile. "We keep going." A woman nearby held up a handmade sign. "United we stand." Mark read the words and felt a new kind of strength. Yes, the city had changed. The world had changed. But in the face of destruction, there was also resilience, kindness, and hope. He took Sarah's hand. "We'll rebuild, together." As the sun rose over the grieving city, one thing became clear: New York would rise again. The world had seen darkness, but light would always find a way.